So if you remember from last time I was up here, doesn't seem like that long ago. Y'all are going to get tired of me at some point. So I've been spending a little time in the book of Esther. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about, another just kind of a lesson kind of gleaned out of Esther, really deals with kind of a corollary to our weekend down at CYC with the theme of Unashamed. And so again, we're going to take just a quick look at some things that happened in Esther. We talked before, just quickly, about, maybe we are where we are for a reason, whether that be low or whether that be high. But more than that, I want to look at a couple of actions from Mordecai and from Esther herself that maybe we can take some example from and get something out of this. So in Esther chapter 2, and verses 21 and 23, we find some events that's happening. That Mordecai, he's a captive. He's kind of high-ranking. He's doing well for himself, but he's still a captive. He's still a pilgrim. He's not where he's not at home. But he does service for the king. He finds two eunuchs. He overhears them. They're plotting to kill the king. Whether you like him or not, he says, he's the king. I'm supposed to take care of the king. And so I see a lot of courage in this. Then he goes and reports this. These two men, they're planning on killing the king. And that does take some courage. I mean, just read between the lines for a moment here and think about how people are. One, the king is not actually a really great guy. I think we mentioned that already. Xerxes is not the greatest guy. He just isn't. Let's leave it at that. So, it's kind of, might be an okay thing for him to die, right? But he's courageous in the fact that he stands up against people who would harm the king, someone who has maybe not necessarily harming him, but isn't really doing him a lot of good. But he stands up to these people who would like to remove the king. But on top of that, think about the courage it would take to stand against the people who would say, no, let him die. Again, Xerxes is not a nice guy. You've got the whole Jewish population from Judah over here, and let him die. And he's got to stand against people who might look at him and think that that's just not the right thing to do. Don't do that. Don't do that. The courage that it would take to go against what would be our normal reaction to something like this. And so he stands up to that. And then he was later on, because of this, recorded in history that Mordecai served the king, even though a lot of people may have looked at him and said, no, that's not something you should do. He was courageous enough to do it. But even more so than that, after this, we talked about how Haman, he was promoted. Haman was promoted, and Haman decided that, I'm a good guy now. You all should bow to me. And that's what happens. Whenever Haman walked by somewhere or rode by, he didn't necessarily walk too many places, but when he would go by, he commanded people, bow to me. And you remember, again, this is the leadership in a lot of these countries over there, or in these kingdoms over there. Once you get to a certain level, they started thinking an awful lot of themselves. They got the big head going, and Xerxes considered himself a god king. So why wouldn't his second in command consider himself the same thing? So he commanded people to bow to him. We find this over in Esther in chapter 3. But Mordecai, he sits at the gate of the palace, and as Haman comes by, everybody bows, and Mordecai doesn't. Everyone around him takes a knee. Mordecai doesn't. He stands up. I don't bow to you. I don't worship you. You don't deserve this. You are not God. And that takes a lot of courage for this, because Haman, as we talked about before, he's angry at this. I deserve to be bowed to. Bow. No. I'll kill you if you don't. No. I can almost imagine him getting up on his tiptoes. No, I'm not doing it. And that took a lot of courage. The people around him were bowing, because you don't find any record of Mordecai and Jim, or Mordecai and, Ted. No, just Mordecai standing up and being courageous to know that you are not my God. I don't bow to you. And that takes a lot of courage. We even go look at farther on, and we had talked a little bit about this last time I was up here and thinking on Esther. As even Esther, you remember that the deal was that you didn't go talk to the king. The law was put into place. If you weren't invited to speak to the king, you don't speak to the king. Everybody remember what the punishment for that was? It was death. If you just walked up and said, Xerxes, I'd like to talk to you, you were done. That's how that worked. That's how that law worked. And that was even to the queen. And at this point, Esther is the queen, and she goes to talk to him. Remember, Mordecai has that conversation. Who knows if this is, this is why you were put here for this. Do what is right. And so she steps up, takes her own life in her hands, and goes to Xerxes and says, Xerxes, I'd like to talk to you. I'm sure it was in a different language. But there it is, the courage that it would take to know that I'm going to go in and do this, and doing this thing means my death. But she was willing to do that, willing to take that chance that, if he was pleased with what she had to say, excellent, this would work out so well. If he was unpleased, if he was in a bad mood, if he was just in a particularly foul mood, she'd be killed. And she knew this. And so we look at the courage that it would take these two people to do all the things they would do. And so what we can gather from this, I hope, is that courage is a virtue that is worth rewarding. You look at Mordecai's courage, refusing to bow to a man, refusing to worship a man. You look at Esther and her courage, for entering in the king's presence. And we can take some inspiration from this, that they have it far worse than we do in the most situations that we need to be courageous in. Especially when you're talking about, again, with the theme from CYC this week with being unashamed. It's the corollary there, because you know what it takes to not be ashamed of something? The courage to not be ashamed of that thing. Stepping into unfamiliar territory and not being ashamed of what you know. Stepping into a group of people that are different than you and not being ashamed of being different from them. That takes courage to stand up and do those things. I love the little skit they had there. Old MacDonald had a chicken. The one fella in the skit just kept all the time. He was, oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. And every time somebody walks by, change the song. At the very end, Old MacDonald had a chicken. There was no courage to back up his conviction. And so what I bring us tonight out of the word here is this idea of courage. And in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verses 7 through 8, I love this. For God has not given us the spirit of fear. What's the opposite of fear? Courage. God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Be not thou therefore ashamed of the testimony of our Lord, nor of me his prisoner, but be thou a partaker of the afflictions of the gospel according to the power of God. I love that. In those two verses, it's not a spirit of fear, it's a spirit of power. It's that power of God that he gives us. And so as we go out and we find ourselves again in situations where we might want to shrink back and be a little less than courageous than we should be, remember, we weren't given that spirit to shrink back. We weren't given the spirit to quieten down. We weren't given a spirit to not rock the boat. We were given a spirit of power. We were given a spirit of love and of sound mind. We put those things together and we're unstoppable. Just as we see the examples of Mordecai and of Esther and all the great things that they achieved through their courage. Just their courage, their courageous acts in these small situations. Butterfly effect. They took off, they snowballed, whatever version of that you want to use. They saved the people of God through small, courageous acts. No, I will not bow. Yes, I will go see the king, even though there's a risk of something happening to me. When we go out into our lives, yes, I will stand up and I will proclaim the gospel. I will be an example. I will say no when I need to say no. I will say yes when I need to say yes. And be courageous to do so. Who knows what large things we can begin to snowball into. It's amazing what the smallest things do. And if the smallest things can do such great things, think what the great things are. And all the great things started with a drop of courage. And it's a courage that we should have. And tonight, the invitation here is, if you need to fix something, have the courage to fix it. Whether it's fixed our entire life from the very beginning, we've been messing up, we've never named Jesus, we've never taken advantage of the salvation he offers, have the courage to do that. If we've messed up and we've slid away and we're not doing the things we should be doing, have the courage to fix that. And what's amazing is, and I'm going to promise you this, that's going to be easy because there's a room full of people here backing you up. willing to help you. Nobody here is standing against you to take that step. It's just a little bit of courage that leads to great things. So if you have anything that needs to be taken care of this evening, we are willing, we are ready. It is our privilege and our joy. You just have to let us know. And wouldn't you do that while we stand and sing?